Okay, we are going to follow on from that discussion of how the United States is approaching this issue of space traffic management to now have a talk about how Europe is approaching it, specifically the European Union. While I think a lot of us that have been involved in this conference and this issue of SSA over the last several years are well aware of the many discussions in the United States on space traffic management, they are going on elsewhere as well. The European Union, earlier this year, back in February, announced their own strategy on space traffic management, which was, interestingly, when it was first sort of put out there several years ago, it was billed as taking a different approach from the United States. And this morning, on their panel discussion, we are going to be talking about how the European Union is approaching this use STM, where it's similar, where it's different from the US, and sort of what is the plan going forward for all countries to sort of think about this and maybe eventually coordinate together on space traffic management. And joining me together this morning on the panel are a group of experts who have been directly involved in various aspects of either formulating this EU policy or are working on implementing it in practice. So I'm going to start with the other side of the stage from me, Dr. Pascal Faucher, who has had more than 20 years experience at CNES, the French Space Agency, on a variety of programs ranging from space surveillance to security and international relations. He currently serves as chair of the European Union's Space Surveillance and Tracking, or EU SST program, which is roughly equivalent to the US Space Surveillance Network with some additional features. We'll talk about that in a minute. And he also serves as chair of the International Astronautical Federation's Space Security Committee. Sitting next to him is Dr. Brigina Pelzis. She's the policy officer with the Security and Defense Policy Directorate of the European External Action Service. That's sort of like the State Department for the European Union. There, she focuses on space security, space situation awareness, and threat response. Previously, she was a seconded expert with the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs in Berlin, where she worked on interagency, European, and international coordination, again on space security and space situation awareness. And joining us virtually, we have Rodolphe Munoz. He's at the Directorate General for Defense, Industry, and Space for the European Commission. Over the last 15 years at the Commission, he has worked on a variety of legal issues and currently focuses on implementation of the SSA component of the European Space Regulation, which includes surveillance, tracking, weather, and near-Earth objects. Finally, also joining us virtually is Sebastian Maranta. He's a research manager at the European Space Policy Institute, which acts as an independent think tank, providing decision makers with informed views on issues relevant to the European space policy. Sebastian leads multiple research efforts at SP, including a series of independent reports that helped raise awareness on stakes for Europe in the domains of space security, safety, sustainability, and also space traffic management. So, Sebastian, could you kick us off? Can you recap how the space traffic management issue has evolved in Europe over the last several years, and maybe what some of the major studies that were done and what they found along the way?
Good morning, Brian, and good morning to you all on Maui. So thank you first for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm very happy to join this panel and to share some views on the evolution of STM in Europe. Well, I think, first of all, much has happened. You were talking about the last several years. I think what has been really a trigger for the development of a European approach to STM has been the publication of the US SPD3 on a national approach to STM. And the reason why I think it has really been a trigger is that at the time, the level of awareness, at least of policymakers regarding STM issues was rather low in Europe. And what the SPD3 has done is that it has put STM as an item of, first, the space policy agenda, and second, of the international space agenda, with the ambition of the US to promote best practices and standards for STM. Of course, this raised new questions for Europe, and on our side at the European Space Policy Institute, we sought to contribute to a common understanding across European stakeholders of what was at stake with space traffic management and with the publication of the US SPD3. So a few ideas that we shared in our first report on space traffic management, and that I think were still valid or still in line with the European approach that has been developed. First of all, the recognition that STM is about dealing with new issues for space safety and sustainability, and in particular, the recognizing that there was an inadequate regime and technical capabilities and coordination practices for future space operational conditions. So that's the first element we wanted to raise. The second one is that ultimately STM builds on pre-existing ITEX. So this includes space traffic monitoring, SSA, regulation, coordination, activities that were already ongoing in Europe through the USST, through legal frameworks, but that needed to be further adapted to future conditions. The third idea is that ultimately STM is about setting up a policy and framework to shape and advance these different items to deal with these future space operational conditions and ensure safety, ensure space sustainability and security. And of course, our main conclusion was that there was a need for Europe to develop its own policy, its own framework, as part of a regional approach. So that was on our side. Of course, on the policy making side, I think that maybe the event, the development that really brought space traffic management at the top level of the space policy agenda in Europe has been the German presidency. I think here, so for those who are not necessarily familiar, there's a rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union, and in 2020, Germany took this presidency and made of STM an important item of their agenda. This really fueled the European space policy machinery, and I won't walk you through all the different policy meetings and documents and studies that have been done. Ultimately, the main output of this process has been the communication from the European Commission and the European External Action Service, but I'm sure that Rodolphe and Regina will walk you through the content of this document and how it provides a roadmap for the European approach to STM. I think we can expect in the short term new policy steps, and we are, of course, looking forward to that. Now, with regards to the studies, so of course, there has been also some effort on the European side to consult stakeholders, to coordinate their views on STM to pave the way for this approach. At SP, we took part of two major consortia, EU STM and Spaceways. And well, I am unfortunately not at liberty yet to provide to share the conclusions of this exercise, but maybe I can share a few thoughts and conclusions that apply not necessarily only to Europe but to STM. The first one is I think there is really a need to make sure that technical developments, so technical capability development and regulatory development, are really properly coordinated in view of stimulating the emergence of innovative solutions, maybe also more cost-effective solutions. Here, there is an idea that was flown during discussions of equipping satellites with beacons that would facilitate their tracking. The second point, I think, is to take stock of the raised very recent developments, both on the safety commercial side, but also on the defense and security side. The deployment of mega constellation is going extremely fast. At the time when we published our study, we realized that we were not expecting such quick development. So the urgency of action for STM, I think, is becoming critical. And the second aspect on the defense side is that the stakes are changing also rapidly following the recent developments on the Ukrainian side, and new security, new defense issues are emerging, and that will need to be addressed also using joint capabilities. The last point is on the international side. It's really much at the heart of both US and European approach. I think it's clear that STM is a global issue. I think it is clear that it can be effective only if it comes as a result of an international answer. But we have to probably be practical about these developments. And multilateralism is more challenged than ever. And there is definitely a great need to further strengthen transatlantic dialogue as part of maybe a net of bilateral dialogue. And I think this is also an important conclusion.
Thank you for that. You touched on several things we're going to pick up across the rest of the discussion here. Rodolphe, I want to turn to you. So Sebastian mentioned that all of these discussions and studies resulted in this communique from the European Union. So Rodolphe, can you explain what was in that communique, who published it, and sort of what the decisions were that were announced?
Yes. So first, good morning to everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me for this conference. This joint communication, which has been published by the EU, is a joint communication between the Commission and the EAS. And it's very important because it demonstrates the need, when you tackle STM, to have the civil and military aspects all together. So I think the first point is what that did, this communication. I think it sent a clear message. The message is the EU is really committed to protect the safety of outer space for future generations. So it's clear we want to take actions. And when you look to the communication, it's rather easy to read, and you can see clearly the 10 actions. And in addition, in these 10 actions, what you have 10 clear deadlines. So this is very important as well, because it's not just actions for the pleasure to list some things to do, but as well with clear deadlines. Then who it involves, I think it has been underlined already by Sébastien, but of course, in order to prepare this communication, we had to do a lot of preparatory work. I mean, we worked a lot with the different presidencies of the EU. We had a huge work with the Portuguese presidency, for example, with the Finnish presidency. So let's say it took nearly 2 years of exchanges with our member states, but as well exchanges with the industry. And it's why we launch what we call the CSAs, which are studies in order to involve industry, the EU industry, in order to know exactly what they had in mind. And I think what we wanted to show with this joint communication is that we need to act today. So we have to do something, and we can clearly list actions and concrete actions where we can act, and not only having general discussion about STM. So when you look to the communication, you have basically 4 avenues. The first one aims to collect the really STM requirements from the civil and military side, because it's very important to understand what could be these requirements. Then you have a second avenue, which is dealing more about the operational capabilities, because it's very important. If you want to do some STM, you need to be able to observe what you have up there. And in this part, what is very important for us is to involve as much as possible the industry. And of course, EU SST, which is a system that we have created at the EU level, which is a system where we work closely with some EU member states in order, indeed, to offer collision avoidance, re-entry and fragmentation, but I'm sure that Pascal will talk about it. Then you have a third avenue, which is talking about regulatory aspects. And there is not only binding aspect, but non-binding ones. Indeed, today in space, you have a lot of non-binding rules at the international level. And we thought that it would be interesting to look how we could perhaps further develop these rules, but as well promote the use of these rules. Because today, indeed, for companies, if they want to follow these non-binding rules, this has a cost. So why not finding ways in order to promote the use of these non-binding rules? In the regulatory side, you have as well some binding rules. Indeed, we consider that for some aspect, we need to impose some binding rules. Finally, and there I will not develop that much, is on the international part. Why? Because of course, if you talk about STM and you look only to your own system, it's useless. Of course, it's necessary to do it at the international level. Otherwise, whatever you do will be limited because indeed you need to bring with you the international community. But I guess that Regina will expand on that one. Then I just wanted to conclude on the impact. I think the impact was very positive and still positive. It really created a real momentum. And we received from our member state what we call conclusion from the presidency. Like Sébastien told you, we have rotating presidency. And at the time of the French presidency, it was in June 2022, the French presidency adopted conclusions where all the member states highlighted that they were in favor of all the actions listed in the communication. So for us, it was a real positive message. And we receive as well very positive feedbacks from the industry. Indeed, when we look to the result of the different researches, we see that industry is eager to see something done on the STM side, because of course, if nothing is done, one day we will not have access anymore to space, and therefore no more space market. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. And I want to highlight something you mentioned there, that it took all the EU member states to be part of the discussions and agree to it. So we've heard the last few years about how difficult and challenging it's been for the United States government to come to agreement on this. You're talking about the process that involved more than 24 national governments all coming to agreement on a policy. That's a not insignificant achievement to have been able to do, and it's good to hear the re-endorsement of the French presidency. Pascal, I want to pick up where Rodolphe left off and talk about another part of this, which is an independent source of SSA data for Europe, which the EU SST program has been building. And I know you've been at this conference before to talk about sort of the progress over time. So can you sort of summarize how it's evolved, where it stands now, the SST program in supporting the STM efforts in Europe?
Thank you, Marianne, and aloha, everyone.
Aloha.
Yes, first let me thank you, Secure World Foundation, for having me here in this panel, and I would like also to warmly thank Leslie, Sandy, Annette, all the great team from the Maui Economic Development Board for organizing this very important conference on space situational awareness. So in Europe, we started space surveillance and tracking in the European Union in 2016, already 7 years ago. And we started as a consortium. It's a multilateral cooperation with a consortium of 5 member states in 16. And today it grows very rapidly. We are a fully fledged component of the European Union space program. So it means that we have a dedicated budget line, which is very comfortable. And we are expanding right now towards a new partnership of 15 member states of the European Union. So it indicates that there is currently a high level of political awareness on the importance of SSA and STM, as it has already been said earlier. So what do? We deliver operational 24/7 public services in collision avoidance, atmospheric reentry, fragmentation analysis, and those public services has already been presented several times at technical levels, so I will not enter into the detail. But what I can say here is that those public services will be open worldwide in 23 next year to any users and spacecraft operators outside the European Union. This is what we follow Article 8 of the space regulation in Europe. So this is what we're going to do next year. And we are preparing ourselves for that challenge. We rely on a global network of surveillance radars. We have 2 surveillance radars. One is under the Ministry of Defense, for instance, in France. Another one in Spain. Another one is in construction in Germany. We have 6 tracking radars and more in the future. 3 laser stations, a global network of telescopes, more than 30 telescopes, and it's going to increase with a worldwide distributions. So we share data from different origins. This is maybe something very different compared to the model at the Office of Space Commerce. We share data, military data, we share civil and commercial data. So we merge all those data together in a European database. We build a catalog of space objects, and we have a service provision function. And this is a unique operational model of SSA data sharing and service provision in Europe, clearly. We are also security relevant. As you know, everything out there is of concern for our military. There's a lot at stake up there for the security and safety of our space activities. And therefore, our defense and national security stakeholders are very much involved in our strategic decisions. So this is really a group, a consortium, a partnership now where we have both MODs and civil and NSA stakeholders working closely together. On USST, so this is a civilian program, but it has, of course, a dual dimension, which is very important, and possible implication in security and defense. So that's why we have this very close relationship between civil and defense. Our priority right now in Europe is to develop a higher level of strategic autonomy in terms of capabilities, in terms of sensors, for surveillance and tracking of space objects in all-orbit regime. And so we do it incrementally. We are pragmatic according to the budget available. And we rely also on the important national investment of the member states. So this has to be taken into account because the member states right now are investing very much at national level in SSA capabilities, and the European Union funding complement those national investments, so there's a leverage effect where we can accelerate in terms of the development of sovereign capabilities. And now our top priority is to foster innovation and competitiveness of the European industry and startups in the SSA domain. So this is right now where we are. And we believe that the industry and startup can contribute and reinforce our strategic autonomy in Europe. And we must determine also the right balance between public data and commercial data. Public data right now in USST are mostly military data. So I think that the right balance should be around 50-50 in the next year. So this is a target that we should reach. Right now, regarding the industry, I'm very happy because 80% of the public funding is subcontracted to the industry with open tenders. And in total, we are working with 73 different companies in Europe on space surveillance and tracking. But we want to do much more. We want to do much more because we acknowledge right now, today, that we have a vibrant and energized commercial SSA ecosystem in Europe, which is stable to drive innovations in the next years. And there's an extraordinary dynamism right now from the private sector that we have never seen before in Europe. And I think we have been very much inspired by what has been done in the US. And the industry kept telling us that you need to accelerate, you need to go faster, the clock is ticking, because in the United States you are going very fast as well. So that's the reason why we have established this year, in April 2022, a European Union Industry and Startup Forum to foster the dialogue on space traffic management following the joint communication, to foster the dialogue and intensify the dialogue with the industry to really build a competitive ecosystem, commercial ecosystem in Europe with industry and startup to accelerate the acquisition of commercial data, to develop innovative commercial capabilities, sensors under specific criteria of co-funding. So this is in summary where we are. We are already in this dynamic of supporting the industry and startup because there's an unprecedented dynamism in this domain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting to hear sort of the focus on the commercial as well as bringing in the data from multiple European governments and their sensors. So Regine, I want to turn to you. We've mentioned a couple of times here that another element of the EU policy is the multilateral engagement. And there's been lots of discussions here about, how do we get the international piece of this done? So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. How is the EU in your position is, I'll say that State Department for the EU, thinking about doing that multilateral engagement on this topic?
Thank you, Brian. It's a great question, and I first of all want to echo my thanks again for inviting this dedicated discussion on the EU approach from our perspective. So you've heard we're looking at capabilities, we're looking at regulation, and Rodolphe already highlighted, and Sebastian, that we want to partner with others because we believe that STM is a global challenge and requires a global effort for which lends itself, but also requires cooperation. So this is one of the baseline assumptions that we've had for this approach. And we describe in the communication something we call a regional contribution to this global effort. And I'll explain a little bit what this means and how we want to engage to that end. So what we have in Europe, our capabilities, our best practices, the regulation we develop will be our regional elements or our contribution that we offer to bring towards the global table in that sense. But we also recognize, of course, that there are other regions in the world that are developing or have existing SSA capabilities and STM policies and an interest to engage in that area. Most notably the US, of course, we've heard from Richard earlier, but we also see in Asia Pacific and other regions that there's a real interest and concrete capabilities that we could all bring together in a way. So we believe that these different regional, we wouldn't call them hubs, but they will all be able, we hope, to work together. And if you think back to what Pascal was mentioning about the cooperation we have in SST and what Rodolphe was mentioning about reconciling policy ideas in Europe, we already have very different partners and member states in Europe who are cooperating on that for these type of operations and this policy. We have nations with maneuverable assets in orbit who have been doing SSA for a long time. We have others who don't have satellites but still buy into this effort. And we've seen how rewarding this type of cooperation can be when we try, and it's not easy, but we try to bring our databases, our sensor assets, our different structures and organizations together. So they're still discrete and separate, but we work together. So this is something we believe could not only just happen on the European scale, but we could do this with other partners together on a global scale. And we already have this multi-party cooperation in our sense. So this is the idea that we have, to bring what we have to a global table. And we, to this end, we want to engage on 3 levels in the types of dialogues that we're developing. First of all, we propose to continue the privileged discussions that we have with the US as the most advanced partner, both with a concrete STM policy in the form of SPD3 that Richard outlined and that we've been talking to his predecessor Kevin about, and who is, of course, the most sophisticated and advanced space surveillance capability on whose data Europe and the European member states still rely to a large extent, so from the 18th. And what we want to do is to continue to explore how what we're developing can be mutually interoperable and complementary to what's happening on the transatlantic side. Then we want to pursue also active diplomacy beyond the US with third states who may or may not have SSA or space capabilities. Again, we believe that it would be good to create confidence and create redundancy in working together, but also bring those partners on board who do not have space asset, but perhaps who depend on space services and who will be able to lend this kind of momentum and have a stake and an interest in keeping space safe. And finally, we want to foster also discussions on the UN level with relevant bodies and specialized agencies that are already dealing with space safety. We know the LTS and UN Corpus, but we're also thinking about ITU, who manages orbital resources, and ICAO, who's engaged in elements of launch safety. So we also see this as one area. And I'll stop here for the international side. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And so, Sebastian, I want to turn back to you. We sort of heard this discussion of this is what the European Union is proposing, what they're doing. And I mentioned, so you mentioned in your opening remarks that this was in some ways kicked off by the American announcement of Space Policy Directive 3. And there was some sense that Europe was trying to come up with a different approach. And I would like your take as an analyst who's looked at both what the US is doing and what Europe is doing. How much do you see similarity between the EU approach and the US approach, and where do you think there are differences? So Sebastian, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. I think it's an excellent question. Actually, I had never really taken the time to think about potential differences between the approach, because I think that ultimately the approach is built on a like-minded rationale and objective. So there are probably more commonalities than differences, because the objective is the same. Ensure safety, ensure sustainability, ensure security of space systems in the future operational conditions that we will all share as with no borders in space. Now, so thinking about the differences, I think they were probably of two nature. First, there is a matter of advancement. As you heard from my dear co-panelists, things are moving in Europe and are actually moving quite fast, I believe. But there is still probably more advanced reflections and decisions on the side of the US with regards to, first, the establishment of the framework, on identifying roles, responsibilities, and sharing these roles and responsibilities, even though I understood from the previous keynote that there were still major discussions on this, and that the US had its own hurdles in the process, and of course also the relations between the stakeholders with agreements and cooperation between the different stakeholders on the military and civil side. The US is also probably more advanced in terms of updating the best practices and standards related to STM. So there is, of course, the whole process of consultation that was already done and that concluded with some updates on the orbital debris mitigation rules, on the side of the FAA, on the side of the FCC, and of course I am expecting strong reactions on the European side. Probably very positive, as I was saying, like-minded objectives on the new 5-year rule of the FCC. And there is also probably more advanced, actually, not probably, I think, obviously, more advanced on the side of the capabilities, because the US is, of course, building on already quite advanced SSA capabilities that were prepared, designed, developed with a military and national security rationale, but that will, of course, be extremely useful for the purpose of space traffic management. Probably also more advanced in terms of commercial ecosystem. I agree with Pascal that definitely things are moving and moving fast here. Also in Europe, there is plenty of business endeavors, plenty of business ideas, and really willingness to contribute to the effort. And as Pascal was saying, the clock is ticking, but Europe is moving forward. So there is I guess, a difference with regards to the advancement. And maybe on the other side, there is also still some differences in the framework that Europe is developing, and that of course is shaped by the European broader policy and technical landscape. First of all, there is this additional layer of harmonization, coordination. Europe is still 27 countries, so the European Union is still 27 countries that you have to bring together for operational cooperation, operational coordination, and to have to bring together on decisions. And this creates, of course, an additional layer of maybe difficulty in harmonizing everything. The second major difference, I would say, as you got it from Pascal, is that I believe European stakeholders are also much more comfortable with a real dual approach to space traffic management, and really bringing together and addressing together safety issues, safety sustainability issues that I would consider rather civilian, and security issues that would be more of military nature. And of course, this builds on the nature, the pre-existing nature of the European cooperation, the USST, which is really a dual framework. And it also builds on the idea that ultimately everything is interconnected. The security, the safety, the sustainability of space systems, be they military or civilian, is of course very much interdependent. On the commercial side, there is probably also, in terms of differences, I think STM right now in Europe is still very much conceived as a public service, with greater contribution from commercial actors. I think this is maybe something that could lead to a slight difference between the approach in the US and Europe. And maybe last point is I'm aware that there are some diverging views sometimes on some aspects of the best technical approach to ensure space traffic management. So there is probably different views on specific technical items, but I think there is really a common willingness to work together with American counterparts to develop solutions together.
Thank you. It's very interesting sort of comparison, and for me, I'm going to be interested to see how the U.S. Europe is sort of pushing each other, both on the technical side and the policy side, which I think is a good thing for everyone to kind of keep it going. Rodolphe, I want to go back to you and pick up on this question of regulation, because I think most of us here in America probably assumed that the EU approach to space traffic management would involve a lot of regulation about what could and could not be done in space. But as you talked about, that is not quite the approach you're thinking about it. So if you could give a little more detail sort of on what at the EU level you're thinking about for both, potentially some regulation on what should be done in space, but also incentives for following those non-required rules that you mentioned? Did we lose Rodolphe? Oh, no, there he is. Okay. Rodolphe, you're muted.
Now it works.
Excellent.
Yeah, sorry. So I said that this question on the way to approach STM and on the need to have some regulation, I think this is a very good example to show that we are in the same line than the US. I mean, what I was there when Richard made his introductory speech, and he was saying, I mean, you will have some obligations, and I think it's something important. But when you look to the STM communication, you have one action out of 10, which is really linked to binding rules. And why? Because we consider that today, in the field of safety of space, it's, I mean, the space sector is mature enough to have some limited obligation imposed. Indeed, I always take the example of other sectors. I mean, if you take aviation, if you take cars, when it started, you had no rules for aviation. But at one stage, because of the traffic, you had to develop some rules. And at that time, some people were opposing that rules, saying, well, we don't need rules. We didn't need rules at the beginning. I mean, for the safety side of cars, it's the same. I mean, when you impose the belts, some people were complaining and saying, no, it's not right. We were living without belts until now. Why do we need one? And I think what we want to do is to impose some limited obligation. So if I take again the example of the car, I mean, for the cars, you impose the belt, but you did not impose at the same time the airbag, the anti-lock braking system. No, you went step by step. And I think what we want to do is to impose some limited obligations, such as, for example, if you send something in space, you need to have a collision avoidance system of quality. I mean, today it seems reasonable to have something like that. And when you talk to the industry and to the industry who is serious, they are telling you, yes, indeed, we need to have that. Why again? Exactly for the same reason than my conclusion on on your first question, because industry realized that today with the growing number of satellites, and if you look, for example, to the registration at ITU, we can expect hundreds of thousands of new satellites. Even if 20 or 30% will materialize, it will be like multiplied by 10 the number of satellites. Therefore, if you want to keep the orbit as a safe place where you can have everybody enjoying the right and the possibility to provide services, you need to develop certain obligation. But what is very important, and this is really something where I think, again, we are really in line with the US, is if we want to impose some limited obligations, of course, we don't want to prescribe any technical obligation. So we can, of course, say you need to have a collision avoidance system of quality, but we will not list all the technical aspects. For the technical aspect, you have standards, or you can develop new standards, and this is not the role of the legislative side to go in so much details. So I think it's very important to understand that this legislative approach, this binding approach, is really meant to help the industry to make sure that we can still enjoy, indeed, space in the next years to come. because we all know that if you have one or two big collisions, and it can happen, I mean, the people working in the field will tell you, yes, it can happen. It's a matter of probability. Then it will be a catastrophic event. And if it happens in LEO, I mean, it will be a catastrophe for GEO, because if you need to go to GEO, you need to go through LEO. So, and it will be a catastrophe to go to the moon. It will be a catastrophe to go to Mars. So we will be stuck in our beautiful blue planet, but still stuck. So this is for the binding part. For the non-binding part, and I will be shorter there, is really to say that when we discuss with industry, we realize that some industry or some companies are following these non-binding rules, and it's true that this is done on their own choice, because for them it's important. But then, of course, this has a cost, and compared to the other who are not following them, then this is unfair competition. So why not developing some, for example, some safety labels in order for companies following these non-binding rules to be able to promote it. And when we discuss, for example, with the financial side, I mean, you have more and more funds looking for this sustainable approach. So I think this would be a good way as well to promote other obligations, but in a non-binding way through incentive measures.
Great, thank you very much. Looking through the audience questions here, Pascal, there's several that relate to sort of the plans for the data side of things that I want to try and maybe pull together. So one of them is, you mentioned that you're going to be launching a public service. Is that going to look like Space Track? Do you know when that's going to be available? And you know, you said sometime 2023?
Yes, thank you, Marianne, for the question. Indeed, we are going to open the three existing public services in collision avoidance, atmospheric reentry, and fragmentation to the public. To the public, I mean, for CA, it's going to be for spacecraft operators only. And to do that, we are going to rely very much in the short term also on increasing the acquisition of operational commercial data from the private sector. So we need to take the right decision in the short term to really pass more and more operational service contract to acquire those commercial data, to enlarge our European database and increase the quality of our service provision. So this is part of our very short-term plan. And we also have in mind to act as not only as a public anchor customer, but also as a public investor. We want to invest in new commercial capabilities, innovative, with under specific criteria of co-funding. Those commercial capabilities will remain, will be owned and operated by the private sector. And we are very interested by the result, because we will be interested to acquire those commercial data from those newly built commercial sensors. So this is a virtuous circle. And regarding the third pillar of our strategy regarding commercial actors, it's about commercial services and data. And we need absolutely to, this is a discussion that we're going to have in this European Union Industry and Startup Forum, is we have existing public services, you have commercial services, and we don't want to compete. I mean, I'm fully in line with what Richard said earlier. We don't want to compete with the industry. We want to promote, enable, facilitate the emergence of all those commercial services, and we will promote those commercial services to our user community, encourage them that you have a minimum access to a public service, and in addition, you should also have access to advanced commercial services. So this is what we intend to achieve really in the short term.
So follow-up, two-part follow-up. One, are you open to buying data and services from non-European countries, and maybe some of the American companies that the audience would like to know? And second, Rich mentioned that you had both been talking about potentially partnering or sharing data. Is the vision to eventually maybe fuse all that together into one service, or is it more of keeping a separate sort of the US and European and maybe sort of comparing notes occasionally sort of a thing?
I mean, there will be several public services available and plenty of commercial services available. And if you visit the room, the different booths here in this conference, you will see that plenty of commercial service provider in the SSA domain also offer a free service, a free basic service. So this is very interesting in terms of model. So I do not see any conflict with having several public services available and plenty of innovative advanced commercial services, which is absolutely necessary. We need this dynamism. We need to support this extraordinary dynamism. And regarding commercial data, I would say that right now in the space regulation, we are not authorized to buy commercial data outside of the European Union for operations because of security reasons, which is done at European level. But for R&D, this is feasible.
Great. Regina, I want to turn to you, and unfortunately, maybe the most difficult question that has come in is the China question. So you mentioned that as part of this, there's a multilateral outreach aspect, and you talked about talking with the US, but Rich mentioned that the US so far has found it very difficult to engage with China on this issue of space traffic management and space safety practices. So has the EAS had a chance to think about that? Have you had any discussions with China? And I'll also bring in Russia, who's also a large space actor at the moment. How are you approaching that question of talking to not only the friends and allies, but all the major space operators?
So I think this is a really tricky question. I think someone very clever called Richard said some weeks ago actually that we don't have the luxury of excluding Russia and China from the, let's say, operational discussions. So I think as one of the parts inside the communication, I think it's in the regulatory part, we highlight that I think it would be absolutely necessary to have provisions or mechanisms that we are able during operational situations to contact somebody from different kind of operators that aren't necessarily like-minded in order to deconflict. And I think maybe I want to connect this a little bit to the issue also related to space security versus space safety and traffic management. For us, space traffic management is really a safety issue. At the same time, of course, we see that there are some links to space security. One of my colleagues already mentioned it. Pascal already highlighted we're also part of the 280 satellites I think he's protecting from collision. We also have military satellites that support defense and security missions in Europe. So we want to make sure, for instance, that we take their requirements on board in this overall global context. We also know that we are using SSA sensors that are both military and civilian in Europe. We have both kinds, and we know that they can be used for safety, but also for threat awareness. So I think we see some areas there. And we know that, for instance, with the recent Russian direct ascent ASAT, that's a security-relevant event, but it poses safety problems to us because of collateral debris. And so vice versa, and I think to tie this up again, we believe that through increasing the safety and resilience through STM of our infrastructure and to collaborate with partners and also to protect their infrastructure, that enables us to get abreast of and keep on top of this very complex backdrop against routine collisions, routine conjunctions every day, against which any threat would be unfolding. So that will enable us, doing that will enable us to then discriminate when we see something more unusual and that's related maybe to adversaries. So for us, STM is safety, but I think on the issue of looking more at adversaries and security defense elements, I would just have a little plug to keep your eyes peeled for another strategic reflection beyond STM that we have upcoming for space security defense.
And I think that's actually an interesting discussion about similarities and differences between the U.S. and European approach. I think that is actually an area of difference, is that you're approaching this as one entity that is doing both parts, the safety and the security, whereas in the U.S., as we talked about, we're sort of having this split approach, with commerce being the lead for part of the safety and the DoD being large for some of the security aspects. I think that's interesting. We are just about out of time, so I want to give each of you, 30 seconds or so for any kind of closing remark, something to think about as we go ahead, or maybe a preview of what's coming next from this policy. So Sebastian, I'll give you the first crack at this.
Well, hopefully what came out of this discussion is that there is really a like-minded approach. Of course, there are some differences in the implementation, and that, of course, because there is this like-minded approach, the relationship between the US and Europe in the further implementation is going to be essential, and definitely needs to be further strengthened and thought and reflected upon with these future space operational conditions in mind.
Great, thank you very much. Rodolphe?
Yes, well, here I just would like to say that, as I mentioned, we have very strict deadlines in the communication, and for the moment we stick to these deadlines. So I hope that we will be able to go on like that. So this means, as I said, that there is a clear commitment on our side to do something. And really the message that I would like to send, and this has been already conveyed, of course, to my US colleagues, is, but as well to the US industry, is that definitely in order to act in the field of STM, you need to work together. And I think this is understood, and that if we work together with these regional approaches, we can keep some differences, of course, because we are not similar, we are different. However, we can, let's say, build all the bridges through standards, through methods, through exchanges, in order to make sure that this regional approach will be compatible. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Pascal?
Oh, yes, so maybe I would like to say a few words about this cooperation that we have with like-minded partners, and in particular with the United States. We have been very much inspired by what Kevin O'Connor at Commerce have achieved, and now we are very happy to collaborate with Richard Delbello. So this is, there's a great team here. And again, SSA is a global and share responsibility. So we are all part of the same game. None of us can do that alone. I always say that. So we're stronger together. So we need to cooperate in this domain to continue the discussion on SSA and STM. On my side, I will deal mostly on the operational capability, and on the other side, I think it's mostly related to regulation. Regarding STM, but yes, I think this is very important that we continue to closely work together in this domain.
Thank you. And Regina?
Thank you, and maybe just to pick up on this, to show a little bit of resonance, where we think our approach resonates a lot with the US transition currently from DoD to DOC, is really that we see this as a safety mission, but we're using similar capabilities, so we will also have a security mission that's separate. So stay tuned for that.
Great. All right, well, everyone, please join me in thanking my panelists for the discussion. I will say one last note. This communique that we talked about is publicly available, so if you'd like to read it and note the deadlines, you can help keep Rodolphe on schedule and on track. That's possible. But with that, we're now going to go on our networking break for the morning, so thank you.